Welcome. You can take a seat. Luckily we have beautiful cushy blue chairs, so they should be comfortable. I'm Christy Kilby Robinson, and today I join over 60 members of the Buddhist Studies group at UVA in welcoming you here today. A cohort of graduate students founded the Buddhist Studies group last year to promote collaboration and exchange among students and faculty across the university, the community, and as your presence here today attests, across the continent and the world. It is our great pleasure to host you here in our beautiful new home, the South Lawn building of the University of Virginia. So this building was designed to evoke the spirit of Thomas Jefferson's academical village, which I hope that all of you guests will get a chance to explore while you're here this weekend. And actually, the architects of this building, this space, were faced with a task similar to ours today, the task of reinventing tradition, of refashioning a classic model for a new age. We are here today to probe new possibilities in the future of Buddhist studies, to form our own academical village that spans the boundaries of space and discipline, to be the architects of the future of our field. So I encourage you all to take full advantage of the opportunities this weekend should afford for deep conversation, for idea exchange, and for the formation of new relationships, all of which will be our bricks and mortar that sustain a place for Buddhist studies in the future of the Academy. And like all building projects, ours depends entirely upon the generosity of donors. So we would like to inscribe some names and extend our thanks and recognition to the Wabash Foundation and to a few entities at the University of Virginia, the East Asia Center, the Religious Studies Department, the Office of the Dean of Arts and Sciences, the Virginia Center for the Study of Religion, the Office of the Provost, and the Office of the Associate Dean for Humanities and Arts. I hear an echo. Maybe it's just me. All of these entities have made this weekend's gathering possible, so we thank them. And now I'd like to ask Professor Curtis Schaefer to come forward, Chair of the Religious Studies Department, to introduce our esteemed keynote speaker. And so enjoy your stay and welcome to the University of Virginia.
Hi, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. It's going to be a wonderful weekend. I'm really looking forward to spending this evening and all of tomorrow and Sunday morning with you. By Sunday morning, we will have to say that to ourselves, that we're looking forward to being with each other. But we still will. It's really, really a pleasure. An honor, but mostly a pleasure to have Gregory Schopen here with us. If we were to map his trajectory across the landscape of higher education in the U.S., it would look like a map of Buddhist studies. He's taught at many of the major places where Buddhist studies flourishes, and that's no accident. Indiana University, the University of Washington, Stanford University, currently at UCLA and at Brown University. Picking up a MacArthur Fellowship along the way. His 3 books contain 40 articles. He's written at least that many beyond those 3 books and is working on a number of major translations, which we will be able to see in the next few years. Schopen has really been able to combine, like almost nobody else, philology, history, art history, archaeology, literature, and theorizing of the field of Buddhist studies and of religious studies more generally. If we look at his contribution to our field, we can think of it as being in 3 primary areas. One, he's upheld a long tradition of studying the history of Indian Buddhism through intense multilingual scholarship. Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan, Chinese. He's utilized all of these to bring to bear what the entire world of Buddhist literature has to say about the history of Buddhism in India. That's no mean feat. It was difficult to do in his day. It's difficult to do in our day. I would say, are under funding pressures that were maybe somewhat different than it was a generation ago. But nevertheless, if we look at our careers over the long run, we can still take that part of his scholarship as a model for our own work as well, if we think of ourselves as lifelong learners. Secondly, he's brought, more than anybody else, the study of social history to the study of Buddhism in India. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And finally, he's used this study of social history to develop a critique of the contemporary study of Indian Buddhism that is still relevant. He did this 20 years ago or more, but it's a critique that still stands today. And I want to apologize for making a quote that's over 20 years old now, but it's still relevant. It's from his article, Archaeology and the Protestant Presuppositions in the Study of Indian Buddhism from 1991. And he writes there, textuality overrides actuality. Textuality overrides actuality for students of Buddhism. This is the critique he makes of Buddhism. And actuality, as expressed by epigraphical and archaeological material, is denied independent validity as a witness. Now, at the time that this was written, this was very true. Doctrinal, prescriptive claims were taken to be statements of fact. They were taken to be descriptive of the state of Indian Buddhism throughout its history in India. Schopen worked to reorient our vision away from prescriptive texts, away from doctrinal texts, to different sorts of texts, but also to epigraphy and to archaeology, to ask, what does the history of Buddhism on the ground look like? And the answer was far more interesting than we ever could have imagined. Now today, in great part because of his work, we cannot say that a text of doctrine has a one-to-one correspondence with the reality of Indian Buddhism at a particular place, in a particular time in its history. We cannot say that easily, but I still suggest that we feel that we work that way much of the time. Right? Now, how did he go about this? How did he go about this transformation? Well, one of the ways he did this is he dedicated himself to open, honest reading, something that we all do. But he picked a very particular body of literature, the Vinaya literature, the 12 volumes of Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya literature contained in Tibetan translation, in the Tibetan canons, over 8,000 pages. A tremendous, tremendous body of work that at the time had received very little attention, very little comprehensive attention on the one hand, and very little detailed attention on the other hand. He dedicated himself to reading through that with as few expectations as he could muster to see what was there. Right? And that is a big, big effort. He told me today that one issue that he was looking for in one later Vinaya text, he wanted to find in the classical collection of Vinaya, and he found that on about page 7,500 after reading through the first 7,500 pages. Now this requires a great amount of dedication. It requires a great amount of trust that you'll find something interesting that you didn't know was there. Right? And this has been inspiring for me, and I think it should be inspiring for all of us too. And I hope that this aspect of his writing will inspire other people to head towards the Vinaya literature too, because it's much more interesting than we ever could have imagined before we started reading his work. There are certain words in our vocabulary now in the study of Buddhism that are commonplace that were far less so before he started writing. And we should still pay attention to those because he's marked out new territory for us, some of which has received very little attention beyond his articles. Monk, nun, donor, slave, stupa, garden, book, bookcase, image, corpse, relic, tomb, bank, loan, debt, inheritance, calendar, clock, schedule, sundial. Some of these things are odd, some of these things are commonplace for us. All of those realia of the life of Buddhism in India have a place in his work, and all of them therefore become objects for us, potential objects for us in a way that they were not before. He, I suspect, is not going to tell us what to do today. But I suggest that a careful and slow reading of his work, both in the past and what he has yet to write for us, will help us imagine what we can write and what we can think about Buddhism in more creative ways than we would have without him. So, Gregory Schopen.
Thank you very much, Curtis, for that introduction. Curtis was kind enough to point out that the reason that I've taught at so many places is that I can't keep a steady job. Is that? I was going to say legible. I think that indicates where my head is. Yeah. But I also really want to thank both Christy Robinson and Manu for having put this together. It couldn't have been easy, at least in my dealings with them. They have been a joy to work with. The only thing I suppose I might criticize them for is their choice of speaker. And I especially came to that conclusion when I saw that Mr. Fitfield describes much of what I do as old-fashioned. So in any case, I really do deeply appreciate the efforts that you've gone to. And I, like everyone, I think, am very much looking forward to tomorrow and Sunday morning as well. Yeah. So I knew, I've been here once or twice before, and I knew that it was de rigueur to start all talks at the University of Virginia with a reference to Thomas Jefferson. So I have done so, in part. Let me start by saying, when I first received the invitation to speak to you, I was both delighted and chagrined. Delighted for a number of reasons. It would, for example, give me another opportunity to visit the University of Virginia, a university founded by Thomas Jefferson, who may have been, after John Adams, the last intelligent president we've had. Both men, moreover, had an interest in Asia and in India. A number of letters survive between Adams and Jefferson, in which they discuss the work of Sir William Jones, who in effect was the founder of Sanskrit and Indian studies. In fact, Adams, and this was in the early 1800s, was then willing to say, quote, "Indeed, Newton himself appears to have discovered nothing that was not known to the ancient Indians." He was referring to Jones's presentation of the materialist, or the Charvakas. But Jefferson's interest in Asia, and something of the importance, perhaps, that he placed on it, might be most clearly indicated by the fact that he, at least according to a guy named Carl Jackson, sought to recruit the Reverend William Bentley as the first president of the University of Virginia. And Bentley not only wrote 3,300 sermons and 56 volumes of manuscripts, but is said to have known more than 20 languages, including Persian and Arabic. And Jackson goes on to say that he has some claims to be remembered as the first American to comprehend an Asian language. As a kind of aside, those of you in the audience interested in rhetoric might have already observed that by opening this way, I was cleverly able to talk about guys who are even older than I am. But again, I was even more delighted by the fact that being here today would give me an opportunity not to speak, but to listen and to see what a new generation, working on that messy and amorphous mix that some still call Buddhism, we're up to. What rings your bell and what fuels your fire. It is this more than anything that will determine any new direction, not some old man. Telling you what might best be done, especially if that old man has serious doubts about whether or not such a thing exists as Buddhist studies. But more on that later. Delighted? Yes, but also chagrined, and for even more reasons. Chagrined because, unfortunately or not, the first thing that came to my mind was an old cartoon that I still have on my wall. It pictures a southwestern American landscape. In the background, you see an old American Indian surrounded by a group of young American Indians, and he is pointing to the ground. In the foreground are two more young Indians, and one is saying to the other, "Yep, when you're too old to hunt, you can always teach a course in how to read buffalo shit." Was I thought, now an old Indian, destined to ramble on in BS 101. In fact, as Mr. McComb, who's in the audience, knows, and it has even been reported, I'm told, on the internet, I already give in my undergraduate courses what I think of as my bullshit lecture. I start by saying that there is an element that should be on the periodic chart in the table of elements, but isn't. That is found everywhere in human discourse and is deeply embedded in scholarship. Since this symbol is not yet known, we might refer to this as BS. Now, BS, I say, is normally found in three forms. And using mathematical expression, we might call these BS to the first power, BS to the second power, and of course, BS to the third power. When this analytical model, and that's what I think of it as, is applied, for example, to the study of early Buddhist literature, this is what we see. BS to the first power is what the Buddha said. We, of course, don't have a clue what he said, but only what different competing groups said he said. And even this is based on very late evidence. And the accumulated enormity of that evidence would suggest that if he said all of this, he said way too much to be useful. BS to the second power follows logically and easily from BS to the first power. BS to the second power is what the Buddha meant. And the problem here is fairly obvious. If we don't know what the Buddha actually said, how on earth can we know what he meant? But BS to the third power, probably the most pervasive and certainly the most insidious, is quite simply what the Buddha really meant. And the problem here is, again, even more obvious. The good thing, however, about BS to the third power is that it almost always carries something like a genetic marker, the ominous adverb. The English archaeologist Philip Ratz, in a delightful little book entitled Invitation to Archaeology, provides his readers with a glossary of terms and expressions commonly found in reading archaeological reports. In the left-hand column is the phrase or word, and in the right-hand column, its actual meaning. Here are some examples. The evidence suggests that actually means if it's twisted beyond all recognition. Virtually certain means I'm on very shaky ground. Obviously, indisputably, presumably, all mean there is no actual evidence. These phrases, or close equivalents very like them, occur, of course, very widely in scholarly studies on things Buddhist. I might cite examples from Reiko Onuma's recent book on maternal imagery and discourse in Indian Buddhism. I do so not because it is a particularly egregious example. It most certainly is not. But because it happens to be the book on Indian Buddhism that I have read most recently. She says, for example, there is nothing explicitly stated to confirm this interpretation, but the associated literature suggests at the very least. But according to Ratt's glossary, this should mean the associated literature, if it were twisted beyond recognition, suggests. Or she says, though there is no explicit mention here of mothers or breastfeeding, the mention of milk clearly serves to liken blah, blah, blah. And according to Ratt's, this equals there is no actual evidence. The point here is, of course, not to pick on Onuma. I found, without much looking, 2 instances where I did the very same thing on a single page. First, I said, what can be seen in these texts from the Mula Sarvastivadin? Undoubtedly, a major literary production of the period between the empires. A little lower, I said, but if, as seems certain, the Mula Sarvastivadin is a major literary production, blah, 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 these too must mean there is no actual evidence. One wonders, indeed, how there could possibly be for such kinds of statements. No, the point here is a simple one. No matter what new directions you end up taking, and in spite of the fact that your elders have not always done so, watch your and others' adverbs and adverbial phrases. These will tell you if you or others are blowing smoke or using mirrors. Watch the same in your written sources. Buddhaghosa, Chandakirti, Tsongkhapa. 2, share our failings and taste for errant rhetoric. Or, put differently, BS to whatever power, wherever it is, whether it's in the 2nd century Sanskrit text or 11th century Japanese one, is still BS. And it might be well to keep track of it. Much of what has been said so far about evidence, for example, must be connected in one way or another with history. But Buddhist studies has a long and uneasy relationship with that discipline. None of what seems to be histories of Buddhism have been written by trained historians. Oldenberg and Rhys Davis were not trained historians. Etienne Lamotte was not, nor was Akira Hirakawa. David Snellgrove was not. Trained historians who have written on Buddhism have in fact written very different kinds of books. I think here of Gunawardhana's for Sri Lanka and his book called The Robe and the Plough, Monasticism and Economic Interest in Early Medieval Sri Lanka. For China, Jacques Journet's The Economic Aspects of Buddhism in Chinese Society. For Japan, I would be inclined to include Susan Gray's The Money Lenders of Late Medieval Kyoto. Even though in her book, Buddhism does not even appear in the index. Like it or not, you will find here in these works, like it or not, you will find history, not some floating imaginaire. This is a very odd situation, although that situation is rarely acknowledged. And it seems to be almost equally odd, at least to me, that one of the very rare acknowledgments that we have that we have a problem occurs in a place where it seems to be least required. Stanley Weinstein's Buddhism Under the Tongue is widely viewed as one of the finest pieces of historical scholarship done by a Buddhist scholar. But here is what he said in its preface. He says, quote, "No one is more aware of the shortcomings of the present study than its author. In the best of all worlds, a history of the Buddhist Church in Tang China would have been written by someone who is at once a historian in the broadest sense of the term and also a Buddhologist. Unhappily, he says, few persons, myself included, possess equally valid credentials for both areas. Not being a historian, he says, I think it only fair to alert the reader to the likelihood of errors in my interpretation of Tang official and other documents, edicts, decrees, ordinances, legal codes, and the like. Here is a clear recognition that we, all of us in Buddhist studies, have a problem. But presenting the situation in terms of an ideal best of all worlds might be too soft. It may be that if Buddhist studies is ever to be anything other than the intellectual backwater that it now seems to be, one of two things must happen. Either hard historians must write more on Buddhist topics, or Buddhist scholars, that's you, must write better history. The first alternative has, of course, great promise if you keep in mind that by far, at least in my opinion, the most important and influential work on Christianity in late antiquity and medieval Europe, for example, has not been done by people in religious studies, but by professional historians housed in history departments. One need only think of Peter Brown, or Carolyn Bynum, or Patrick Geary. But this, hard historians writing on Buddhist topics, is not likely to happen until the second alternative is in place. Until, in short, Buddhist scholars write better history and make it clear that our material matters. It's not an accident, for example, that Peter Brown, in his new book called The Eye of a Needle, when he refers to Buddhist things, refers to Journet's economic history. At the very least, then, this will require that in writing, you refuse to write in what Paul Griffiths long ago quite correctly called Buddhist hybrid English. And scholars writing on East Asia and Tibet are as guilty here as those working on India. Why, one wonders, is there so much Sanskrit jargon, in talking about people who did not know that language? But is this all that is required? And here we may hit the real question that seems to be posed today. A question already, I think, definitively answered, it seems to me, by a wise and wry old cat. I was going to say tomcat, but as a piece of history, it turns out that the gender of the Cheshire cat remains obscure. He's always referred to as it. In any case, when Alice asks it, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" And is this not the question, your question today? The cat replies, "That depends, my dear, a good deal on where you want to be." Where indeed do you want to get to? And what in fact are you up to? I, of course, cannot answer that. But if you want to do history, and as far as I can see, almost all the presenters here self-identify in one way or another as involved in history. Mr. Fitfield, who I referred to already, and I am not picking on, describes his dissertation as, in part, quote, locating narrative in historical context. Christy Robinson and Miss Melnick describe their field or focus as Buddhist history in Tibet and China. And several of you self-identify as art historians. If these are accurate presentations, all I can say to you is brace yourself. Professor Weinstein's preface will tell you something of what you will have to do. If you want to write on the Buddhist history of anything, in any given cultural or geographical sphere, and you want to do it well, you will have to know, for example, documents, edicts, decrees, ordinances, legal codes, and the like, as well as hard historians do, and as well as you might know your specific Buddhist sources. You are also going to have to know about the economy. One of the students here at the University of Virginia, for example, says he wants to track, or he wants to work on the history of the Tibetan cannons. The history of armaments may not help him much, but Professor Schaefer has shown in The Culture of the Book in Tibet that this will require, in addition to a thorough knowledge of what has been done on the history of the book elsewhere, that's in the rest of the world, folks, a detailed knowledge of prices, currencies, surpluses, paper making, and the cost of ink. Is this an exceptional case? I don't think so. Let me cite just one example from my own backwater. A 5th century inscriptional document from the famous central Indian site of Sanchi records the gift, and all such gifts are the legal transference of property, keep that in mind, by a devout woman, who she is called an upasika, to the noble community of monks from the 4 directions, of 12 dinaras as a permanent endowment. The document goes on to specify that with the interest that is produced from these dinaras, 1 monk is to be fed every day, and that 3 additional dinaras are to be given, were given, with the interest from which a lamp is to be lighted for the Blessed One, the Buddha. This single small document almost immediately tells us some important historical things. Some specifically Buddhist, and some not. And some of which are a little startling. It tells us, for example, that in 5th century central India, a woman whose husband appears to have been still alive since she names him, transferred sums of money in her own name and independently. That must mean, contrary to Brahmanical law, that she owned those sums and had the legal right and ability to dispose of them. The document also tells us that the noble community of monks from the four directions was there in Sanchi in the 5th century, a legally recognized corporation which could hold and lend monies. But importantly, its ability to use the interest generated was restricted by the terms set by the woman. She determined what the corporation could do. It tells us too that some monks in Sanchi did not beg, but lived, and probably very well, off the interest generated by such endowments. And such endowments are very common elsewhere, starting from the 2nd century. But what we would need to know to fully exploit the historical information provided by this single document, what is that? It tells us that the interest on 12 denarii could support one monk. But to know what this really meant, we would need to know the value of a denarii. And this would involve knowing how a Roman coin denomination, the denara is a Sanskrit form of the Latin denarius, Roman coin name. How it came to be used in Central India. Or in other words, we would need a good knowledge of both Roman and Indian numismatics. We need to know rates of interest and how it was compounded as a general rule. Or, in other words, Indian economic history and the history of banking. Indeed, the whole issue of capitalism in pre-modern India. This, folks, is Buddhist studies. Without knowing these things, we cannot really know what our woman was willing to give up to support this group of religious men. Nor can we determine the level or the comfort at which Buddhist monks lived or the degree to which they were kept men. If, as appears to be the case, the dinara was a high denominational gold coin, then Our Lady provided a very substantial sum, and our monk would have lived very comfortably indeed. His diet, like his living quarters, would have been far superior to that of the general population that surrounded him. In fact, it is already clear from archaeological sources that no one but kings lived in the kind of elaborate and costly housing provided for Buddhist monks. And this is something that would not surprise your fellow historians. Since they would know, and you should, that wherever forms approaching monasticism have developed, this is the way monks commonly lived, whether in early Christian Egypt or late medieval England. They would know, as you should, that monks, wherever they lived, were more often than not very wealthy by contemporary standards. For example, the Cistercian, you would have to know that the Cistercian monks in Europe made huge fortunes by discovering, promoting, and selling fertilizer, and thereby revolutionized European agriculture. This is religious studies. But if this is the kind of thing we can learn and must know, I think, from the types of sources that Professor Weinstein indicates are required to write good history, then another friend of Alice tells us something else we might well do. "There is no use trying," said Alice. One can't believe impossible things. I dare say you haven't had much practice, said the Queen. Why, when I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Sometimes I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. In a field like Buddhist studies, that has a lot in common with Alice's Wonderland, one may have to believe impossible things in several different ways. Oops. To get at how people in early India, for example, saw the Buddha, one might have to believe that when he wanted to cross the Ganges, he did not need a boat, but flew across, or that he flew up to heaven and stayed there for a time to teach his long-dead mother the Abhidharma. And here it may be easier to believe that he actually did so than that his mother would have found it interesting. One may have to believe that although the Buddha himself was, after his parinirvana, decidedly and doctrinally dead, he was still thought to be, somehow, actually available at every Buddhist monastery in India. Why else, one wonders, was a room reserved for him in all such places, just as it is now for the Dalai Lama? But even very great scholars, in spite of protestations to the contrary, have not always been willing to believe impossible things. Etienne Lamotte, for example, says that he, quote, wants to keep the same place for the miraculous which it has always had in the Buddhist literary sources, because, he says, it gives a more fruitful reflection of the mentality of the disciples of the Buddha. But in practice, as Michael Pye pointed out more than 40 years ago, he does something quite different. For example, Pye says, the Buddha's miraculous crossing of the Ganges by vanishing and reappearing while ordinary people were still looking about for boats is reduced in Lamotte's presentation to, quote, the statement that he crossed the river with great solemnity. At the least, this is a fudge. At the worst, it is bad history, even by Lamotte's own explicitly stated standards, because it does not give a more faithful reflection of the historical mentality of the disciples of the Buddha, but avoids it. This, however, may be only one way in which you may have to practice for at least a half an hour a day believing impossible things. An equally, if not more important way, may involve the enormously heavy, in fact, the staggering weight of the accumulated scholarship that you have inherited. Jane Austen long ago said, and this too has to do with bad history. Jane Austen long ago said, quote, but history, real solemn history, I cannot be interested in. The quarrels of popes and kings with wars and pestilences on every page. The men all so good for nothing and hardly any women at all. You may have to practice believing some other kind of history. A particularly good example here, at least to my mind, is Laurie Meek's recent book called Hokiji and the Reemergence of Female Monastic Orders in Japan. Meeks was able, I think, to set a new direction, not because she knew a lot about Foucault or Derrida, and may have had the good fortune of never having read them, But she knew the work of the historian Carolyn Bynum. Not because she had she was able to do this, not because she had a particular mastery of Buddhist canonical sources, but because she used state histories, diaries, fundraising documents, name registers, and the like. And very importantly, she had gained the linguistic skills to do so. But even beyond that, I suspect that she was able to do something that was not only new, but of lasting value, because she, like the Queen of Hearts, was sometimes able to believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Things that accumulated and received scholarship would simply not allow. That, for example, she says, for most people, Buddhist practice had little, if anything, to do with the study of texts and doctrines. Or that, although it may be tempting, she says, to assume that the writings of Buddhist scholar priests represent the dominant discourse of the period, it is not clear that this was actually the case. That, again, God forbid, Buddhist nuns, she suggests, were perfectly capable of simply ignoring monks and had their own ideas and saw things very differently. She says, quote, while the members of the monks' order made it very clear that they envisioned themselves as the stewards of the nuns, Hoppiji nuns barely mentioned Ritsu monks. Their texts hold Queen Consort Komyo, and not any monk or group of monks to be the leader of the nuns' order. These sound to me like real women. And although her sources for this are rarely available elsewhere, notice that when we have better access to actual women, we are often able to glimpse something similar. In the 5th century inscriptional document from Sanchi, which I have already cited, we see a woman who shows no signs of being overly awed by the local monastic community, but perfectly capable of dictating to it in no uncertain terms how they must use her donation. Meeks, in other words, dared to believe that Buddhist nuns in pre-modern Japan were people. People who had their own ideas and were not and did not want to be just monks with breasts. That they did not have to be or do the same things as monks to have a religious life. That they were able to manage their own affairs. Thank you very much. I, of course, would like to say that I have done half as good for Indian Buddhist nuns as Professor Meeks did for nuns in medieval Japan, but I cannot. For a long time, in fact, I did little more than notice them. I did not dare to believe that they had their own importance and were not just inferior copies of a male ideal. My re-education came slowly and started with canonical text, or sorry, not with canonical texts, but again, with documents. In looking at inscriptional records bearing on the introduction of the image cult at Buddhist sites in India, I discovered by accident, I was certainly not looking for it, that nuns had as prominent a part in it as did monks. That they were easily as numerous and apparently as wealthy. A particular nun named Buddhamitra also came somewhat into view. To judge by the biographical information embedded in a series of these inscriptional documents, this 2nd century nun appears to have been a prominent figure, certainly at Kosambi, a major and traditional Buddhist site, where she introduced the first dated cult images. But also, she was also known in a great part of Buddhist North India. Her name was invoked both at Sarnath, the site of the Buddhist's first teaching, that was 100 miles from Kosambi, and also at Mathura, which was more than 200 miles in the opposite direction. And while a contemporary and she was learned and carried the title Tripitaka, one who knows the whole canon. And while a contemporary learned monk named Bala seems to have been very anxious to associate her with himself in his documents, she, in hers, like Mix's nuns, entirely ignores him. She acts independent of any male. This should have been enough to make the turn, but it wasn't. I, unlike the Queen of Hearts, had not practiced. And the book in which the paper that discussed these things was reprinted was entitled Bones, Stones, and Buddhist Monks, when it should have been Bones, Stones, and Buddhist Monks and Nuns. I was still not ready to include them. Incidentally, and to end all question that you actually can teach an old dog new tricks, the 4th volume of papers is called Buddhist Nuns, Monks, and Other Worldly Matters. And the first 8 chapters deal with nuns. But even if I could not yet believe, I started to read even canonical texts differently. I might give just one example, an example that purports, like all canonical sources, to be a record of an actual event. But this is an event that, at first sight, seems really impossible to believe. The text goes like this. This is, by the way, from the Mula Savastavattapaniya. It says, at that time, and it's fairly long, at that time the nun Stulananda, her name actually means Fat Nanda, saw a young woman, and she had beautiful clothes and beautiful jewelry. When Stulananda saw that, she asked, "Where, little sister, did you get your clothes and jewelry?" "Noble one," the young woman said, "I sell liquor. From that, I have got all of these." Stulananda then thought to herself, "This may be a good idea. I should see if it works or not." Well, keeping that in mind, when she went on further, she saw in another place, a woman wearing dirty clothes, without food, emaciated, and shuffling along. When she saw her, she asked, "Daughter, whose are you?" She said, "I am no one's. What food and clothes are given to me, from that I must make do." "But daughter," Stulananda said, "if that is so, why don't you just start selling liquor?" This is a Buddhist nun, presented to you by a Buddhist monk. She said, "Noble one, how could I start selling liquor just like that? That would first of all require a great deal of money. And even if there was the merchandise, still there are no vessels, nor a large house where drinkers could sit in comfort. Whoever wrote this knew a lot about setting up taverns. Stulananda replied, "If, daughter, I will provide all of that, and will also give you your food and clothing, then you must give all the profit to me." "Very good, noble one," said the woman. Stulananda built a house next to the nunnery and provided it with merchandise and vessels and equipment. And the woman started selling liquor. The liquor there being really excellent, drinkers came and crowded in great numbers. When they saw that, other liquor sellers came to be envious. Stulananda also increased her profits. Then, on another occasion, when liquor was required in the palace of the king, and the king's men had rounded up all the liquor sellers, the latter said to the king's men, "Since a barmaid of Stulananda's is still selling liquor near the nunnery, that barmaid too should be brought in." And they seized her and brought her in. She was sobbing, saying, "Oh, noble Stulananda, these king's men have taken me in." And when Stulananda hurriedly went there, she said to the king's men, "What have you sons of witches? Why have you sons of witches taken my daughter?" Since she is, "But noble one," they say, "does she not sell liquor?" The nun responds, "Since she has put her foot on the neck of those who are hostile, i.e. beaten all the competition, she can do whatever she wants to." Oops. The monks heard what had occurred, and this is the end, and when they reported that to the Blessed One, rather predictably said, "Stulananda has done much that is unseemly. Therefore, a nun must not act as a liquor seller. If she sells it, she comes to be guilty of an offense." This is a canonical text. There are, of course, at least two ways of reading this little text: with the grain and against the grain. The male monk author of this little text undoubtedly meant it as a portrait of disapproval. He wrote it, after all, to justify imposing on the nuns a rule forbidding them to sell liquor. I should note that making and selling liquor in classical and ancient India was women's work, as it was in medieval Europe. So this was a perfectly legitimate female occupation. He almost certainly, the male author, intended to present the nun Stulananda as preoccupied with material gain and profit, greedy, exploitive of the poor, antagonistic to authority, foul-mouthed, and a cause of disapproval or social criticism of the order. That's reading the story with the grain. But reading it the other way, we may say that he also unintentionally revealed another portrait of the nun as well. Read against the grain, this Buddhist nun appears as rich. She can underwrite the startup costs of a major business, entrepreneurial in exploiting the environment that she was forced to live in, concerned with raising the living standards of poor women, independent, and not at all impressed with male authority. She calls the king's men, in effect, sons of bitches, and doesn't back down. One of these portraits obviously is intentional and has clear authorial purpose. The other is inadvertent, and therein may lie its value. One is the explicitly male view. The other, again inadvertently, may allow us at least to glimpse a female view. Both, however, and this is startling, present a picture of a religious woman in early India who had independent agency, independent means, and the right to own and dispose of both real and movable property. This we have been taught to think was, then and there, impossible. But the Buddhist monk who composed the text apparently did not think it was. Would he have made a rule against something he knew could not possibly occur? This and things like it, you will have to decide. Since, although I cannot tell you which way to go, I'm going to Rhode Island. It was described by the staid residents of Massachusetts Bay Colony as a haven for criminals, renegade Indians, religious malcontents, Catholics, and other assorted miscreants. If it hasn't changed much, it should be fun. Thank you.